This is Demetrius Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records Podcast, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history. Except this time, we are not going to be covering a specific case. We are technically not even covering a law that was supposed to apply to criminal cases at all. We are going to take a look at one small section of one bit of the United States Code that has massively impacted who ends up in court when someone commits a crime on the World Wide Web. And this is something that is in the news right now for very important reasons. So I thought this would be a good thing to cover to catch you guys up on some history of why the internet is the way it is.
I mean, I often find myself asking myself why the internet is the way it is. So it would be good to know. And I do. I mean, nothing sounds more like this podcast than just really diving into a close reading of one paragraph of a part of a legal code. So I'm hype. I'm ready.
All right, let's take a deep dive into some of the most important legal language in the entire world, specifically Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996.
I mean, I approve of communications. I'm not sure how I feel about decency, so let's see.
We're going to talk a lot about decency. We are really going to deep dive into the concept of decency in this episode.
Will he be asked if someone is, in fact, thinking of the children?
Oh boy, we are going to think a lot about the children. And on a less funny note, I do want to warn you guys, this is a case that is a discussion of free speech, and very importantly for this bit of legislation and how it has been applied in our legal system, we are going to have to get into talking about illegal speech. I'm going to have to talk about some of the very nasty things floating around the internet that are not and should not be protected speech, like hate speech, terrorism, and child sexual abuse material, which is sometimes, unfortunately, in some of this legal language referred to with the now outdated language that it was referred to in the 90s, child pornography. That is not generally considered the right language to be using today, but that was what it was referred to at the time. So heads up, I'm not going to go into graphic detail about specific cases or material because this is a funny, lighthearted show.
No thanks.
No, thank you. But those subjects are going to come up because they are very important factors in this particular discussion. So with that out of the way, let's get to the fun stuff, which is reading legal language from the 90s about the internet.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't remember anyone understanding how the internet worked at all in the 90s, so I'm sure this will be a real journey.
So let's get to the most important bit of 47 U.S. Code Section 230, Protection for Private Blocking and Screening of Offensive Material. So here is the quote that is going to change the world as we know it. Quote, "No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider." Scintillating stuff, isn't it?
The number of times I just heard the word information, I feel like it's one of those cases where you hear a word over and over and it just stops meaning anything.
It's the information superhighway, baby.
Oh my God. But I mean, how do we hook the tubes in?
All right, so to understand why this little piece of legal code changes the world as we know it, we're going to have to be kind, rewind back to the 1990s. The world is in the middle of one of its biggest technological shifts ever because computers are becoming more affordable and more powerful by the year. In a very short span of time, computers have gone from huge, clunky machines, mostly used by universities and government labs, to small, powerful, user-friendly, and most importantly, personal devices. You can now have your own computer, and you can have a family computer.
Now, do you remember your first computer? Because I remember mine. It was this crappy Windows machine, but I was like so excited to just play with Word and do the stupid word art. I was also like 5, so I was very easy to impress.
I'm actually the child of a computer scientist, so I actually do not remember the first time I was around a computer. I actually learned how to read on Reader Rabbit, like one of the first Reader Rabbits on a black and tan monitor. So I have been let loose around computers for pretty much the entirety of my conscious life.
And yeah, and you can see what this has done to both of us, all of this early computer exposure. So I mean, God help you.
God help you, your children might grow up to be podcasters.
Oh, fate worse than death.
So computers are increasingly powerful machines, and they do a little more than play Reader Rabbit, although that was chiefly what I was interested in the early 90s. These machines can connect to the internet, and the internet is growing faster than the laws regulating who's responsible for all of that content pouring onto the World Wide Web. Because when you stop and think about it for a minute, figuring out who is legally responsible for what goes on the internet and who sees what goes on the internet is pretty complicated. So, this is the age of the chat room and the forum. Internet users are asking each other their ASL in chat rooms that they do not own and that are not government owned. So, somebody who is not the user owns the online space that speech is taking place in, which raises a legal question that does not have an answer yet in the early 90s. So let me give you a hypothetical scenario here. Let's say that user XXX Sexy Booty XXX says something untrue and defamatory about user, what's a 90s movie? Bubble Boy 79 during a heated debate about Top Gun on the Tom Cruise fan club forums.
I mean, I'm just transported all of a sudden. I'm feeling the emotion of the moment. Yeah, I mean, because in traditional publishing, obviously, if it's like a newspaper that chooses to publish something, they're liable for what they publish because the assumption is they're screening everything. But in a forum, right, Mister Sexy Booty, was that the? I
Yes,
want to
let's
make
go
sure
with
I get this
Mr.
right.
Sexy Booty.
I want to make sure I get this right for the indictment, right? Not everything they are producing is being screened by the owner of the forum, the person who physically owns and set up the servers before it is posted on the forum. That kind of defeats the whole point.
So you're beginning to grasp problems. So let's say that Bubble Boy decides to lawyer up and sues Sexy Booty for libel. But can Bubble Boy also sue the owner of the Tom Cruise fan club? Because the Tom Cruise fan club is hosting this libelous speech on their forum. Like you said, if the Tom Cruise fan club were a newspaper, they would be a publisher, and publishers can be held legally responsible when they distribute illegal material. So, should the owners of internet forums be held to the same legal responsibility as newspaper owners when it comes to their user speech? On one hand, yes, they are like newspapers in the sense that they own the place where the speech was published. But on the other hand, any user in a forum can write on it, and a moderator does not personally approve and decide to publish every single post, like you said.
Yeah, it's a huge bottleneck. It kind of shuts the whole conversation down.
Yeah, that's just not a feasible way to run a forum, even back in the 90s, where there were a lot fewer people online than there are today. So in the early 90s, two separate legal cases put this question to the test. In 1991, there's Cubby v. CompuServe. So a man named Robert Blanchard owns Cubby Inc., and he publishes a newsletter called Scuttlebutt. CompuServe hires a subcontractor called Cameron Communications Inc., which manages its journalism forum. And that subcontractor gets a journalist named Dawn Fitzpatrick to publish another newsletter called Rumorville USA, which is hosted on CompuServe's journalism forum. So Fitzpatrick and Blanchard do not like each other very much. And Fitzpatrick starts publishing some nasty things in Rumorville, calling Scuttlebutt a, quote, new startup scam, and suggesting that Blanchard was fired from his last job and has a backdoor to the information that he is posting in Scuttlebutt. Blanchard sues Fitzpatrick for libel, business disparagement, and unfair competition. But he also sues CompuServe because CompuServe is the company that hosted Fitzpatrick's defamatory content, and he is arguing that they are its publisher. So the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York has to take a look at this case, and they find that while CompuServe is hosting the content, the company doesn't really get a chance to review that content. That just kind of gets one-click uploaded as soon as the user puts it onto the forum. They take their guidance from a case from the 1950s, Smith v. California, which involved a bookseller in Los Angeles appealing his conviction for possession of an obscene book. What that ruling said was basically a distributor like a bookseller can't read every single one of the thousands of books in their store. They don't have omniscient knowledge of whether one of those books might happen to contain obscene material. So while a publisher would be held liable for libel, that's a fun thing to say, a distributor wouldn't be. So CompuServe distributes this newsletter, which contains the libel, but it does not publish it, and thus it is not legally responsible for it.
So, in the kind of tortured metaphor, if at all, is that your average internet forum or a website today is not a publisher in the sense of like the New York Times publishes a newspaper. They are a bookstore. And just like you couldn't sue Barnes and Noble if they sold a book that says something mean about you, you can't sue the website or the kind of hosting service for hosting something mean about you because they are analogous to the bookstore, to the Barnes and Noble, not to the newspaper.
Exactly. That is case number 1. But case number 2, Stratton Oakmont v. Prodigy, complicates this. So in this case, Prodigy Services Company is running the Money Talk bulletin board. An anonymous user starts talking shit about Stratton Oakmont Incorporated, a brokerage firm, and its owner, Daniel Porish. Prodigy's forum is moderated. It has content guidelines, moderators who enforce those guidelines. It even has one of those 90s programs that automatically filters offensive words, real state-of-the-art stuff.
Oh, the future is now.
So this time, when the New York Supreme Court rules in this case, they decide that having a moderated forum means that Prodigy has editorial control. It means that Prodigy is a publisher, not a distributor, and thus is liable for an anonymous user's defamatory statements. So there are two conflicting rulings here. And they create what is called the moderator's dilemma, which means if you moderate your forums, you are legally liable for them. But if you don't moderate your forums, if anything goes, you're not.
That seems like a terrible precedent.
Yeah, this is creating an extremely dangerous legal precedent here.
Yeah, so basically the incentive is to never moderate because you'll never be legally liable then. Wow, that's awful. That's a terrible idea.
This is a very dangerous precedent for the internet. So 2 US congressmen actually, from opposite sides of the aisle, back when it was much more common to cross the aisle. So Chris Cox, who is a Republican from California, and Ron Wyden, who is a Democrat from Oregon, realized that these two rulings are creating an incredibly dangerous situation on the internet. Because even back in the comparatively tame 1990s, unmoderated forums are going to go to shit very quickly. And when we talk about the kind of content that might need to be moderated on the internet, we're not just talking about 2 competing newsletter owners getting into a fight. We're talking about some pretty nasty stuff here. Freedom of speech does not mean that anything you could possibly say or post is legally protected by the First Amendment. There are some very necessary limits on those First Amendment rights that you have if you are American.
Yeah. Well, defamation is probably the easiest thing to end up in court. I mean, I just going off of the history that I happen to be familiar with. If you don't know your internet deep lore, one of the oldest discussion boards on the internet is Stormfront, the neo-Nazi website. So it's not just like don't say mean things about the internet or about other people on the internet. That's why this needs to get fixed. It's also because, yeah, people start figuring out shitty ways to use the internet pretty quickly.
There are actually criminal things that you can post online. For instance, like you said, in cases like Stormfront and other hate forums, there's incitement, fighting words, and threats, aka speech that can turn into real-life violence. That is not protected by the First Amendment. There is also child sexual abuse material. Documentation of real-life child abuse further harms victims through its distribution. That is illegal. It should be illegal. Fraud, which is deceiving someone to scam them out of something. Plenty of fraud going around on the internet now and then.
I don't know what you're talking about, Demetria. That Nigerian prince is absolutely legitimate.
And of course, there's our old friend obscenity, that tough to define lewdness that we know and we see. That the question of whether that is protected by the First Amendment is something that we just love to return to on this podcast.
I do love that because of the CompuServe sort of precedent that's being built off of that case from the 50s, Smith v. California, I think you said it was called.
Mm-hmm.
Like, technically, the foundation of the internet, in not just in like the joking the internet is for porn, like Avenue Q sense, but like literally in the legal sense, the internet was founded upon pornography, which I feel like is it coming full circle if it is literally where you like you have to leave in order to come back and go full circle. The internet's just kind of in a static place where it's always been about pornography.
Well, this is exactly what Cox and Wyden are so worried about, because they're less concerned about the other issues of illegal speech on the internet. They say let the criminal system sort that one out. We're worried about pornography, and we're worried specifically about children being able to access pornography, which will be incredibly easy to do if all forums become unmoderated. They are very
Yes.
worried about the internet filling up with porn and thus filling the brains of children with boobs.
At long last, we are thinking about the children. Won't somebody, at long last, think about the children?
They are thinking so hard about the children, and they want to encourage companies to think about the children too by moderating their forums. And they want to make sure that the law is very clear that moderation does not make you civilly responsible, not criminally responsible. Keep that in mind. This is not supposed to apply to criminal law for what your users post. The forum owner should not be considered the publisher. They should have the ability to moderate without having to worry about their moderation decisions, making them liable for what does end up being on their forums. So Cox and Wyden introduced the Cox-Wyden Amendment to tackle the rising problem of internet pornography. That's right, the Cox-Wyden Amendment, a very serious law about internet porn.
Guys, are we not doing phrasing anymore?
Not surprisingly, this generally gets called the Communications Decency Act instead. And Congress decides to go ahead and tack it onto the Telecommunications Act of 1996. So President Clinton, who is a man who knows a thing or two about lewdness, signs it into law in February 1996. So the moderator's dilemma is solved. So the moderator's dilemma is solved. And that is the start of what has been described as the rule that made the modern internet. Now, most of the text of Section 230 is actually concerned with hashing out details of things like family-friendly internet blocking software, and that happens on the user's end, not on the end of whoever is moderating the forum. But let's again repeat what that very important piece of text says. No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So, this law is only supposed to apply to civil cases. Content for which the companies would be criminally liable is supposed to be handled differently. But functionally, this essentially becomes a pretty broad criminal immunity for companies for a very long time. So when someone gets defrauded because they saw a message on an AOL message board, AOL does not end up in court for its role in aiding and abetting that fraud. When somebody posts a picture they absolutely should not be posting on Twitter, Elon Musk doesn't end up in court. Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, and I don't like it. I mean, I know, I know there are reasons for why we do things this way, and we'll get to them, but I just like Elon Musk suffering. I'll be honest. I'm a simple man.
So let's do a quick speed run through a couple decades of internet history here. So in 1996, internet users might be spending some time on forums, but the majority of the internet was websites owned by individuals or companies. A handful of forum moderators could, if they were so motivated, clean up the worst user behavior and keep the user-generated bits of the internet civil and sanitary. Section 230 is doing its job in the way it was intended to work. But fast forward a decade to 2006, Tom is on your top 8 in MySpace. This total weirdo named Mark Zuckerberg has just turned his hot girl ranking website into a website that college students mainly use to throw ragers. Wacky videos of squirrels and men with salad fingers are moving from albino black sheep to this new hosting site called YouTube. Jack Dorsey has just twatted his first tweet. A storm's a-comin'.
God, I mean, sorry, I'm just really having a moment of transport back to 2005, 2006. It's it's really bringing back some powerful memories that are mostly appearing to me in the form of Angel City's web pages with flashing RGB text on them.
Did I bring you back? Did I bring you back to the smell of your friend's basement as you drink balls at a LAN party?
Excuse me, we were Coca-Cola people, and also none of us had desktops, so we really just synced up Xboxes, or we went to the computer store. Shout out to Computers on Hudson and my Computers on Hudson gang. Age of Empires 2, Counter-Strike 1.5. Got me through high school.
All right, so let's fast forward another decade to 2016. With so much content on users' feeds, social media companies, which have pretty broad immunity from any kind of worries about ending up in court over what their users are posting, have started experimenting with serving up that content algorithmically instead of in strict chronological order. So companies like Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram are beginning to put their thumb on the scales of who sees what, so they can charge advertisers for better placements in the feed, and they can encourage users to stay on their sites and apps for longer. And users begin to learn how to game the system by producing increasingly provocative content for engagement, which the algorithms tend to reward.
Yeah, I think this is something, it's only kind of tangentially related to what we're talking about, but particularly, I want to shout this out to our Gen X and older listeners out there. If you are not aware of how social media actually works, any engagement with material, even if it is writing, I hate this, you suck on it, will lead most algorithmic services. Like, they view that as a positive. Like, it is you engaging, and that is what they want. They want you to be engaged. So they will serve up more stuff like that and promote it more to other users. So
Yes, indeed. And we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but we're going to talk about some very interesting cases happening today with what algorithms serve up.
But yeah, just my older friends, do not, when you see that inflammatory rage post, don't click on it. You're not fighting the good fight when you tell them in the comments to eat shit. Just hide it. Just hide it. That's what you do. Please, as a person who grew up on the internet, please help me save what little decent bits are left.
So let's fast forward to the trash fire that the internet is today. Over 500 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. Facebook has 2.9 billion monthly users, so over 60% of all internet users in the entire world access Facebook at least once a month. Twitter just let a bunch of banned users back onto the platform as Elon Musk steers his company straight into the toilet. MySpace Tom is living his best life offline.
Yo, God bless MySpace Tom. What a guy. I hope you're doing all right, man. You're still in my top 8.
And TikTok keeps its user data extremely close to the chest. I was having a really hard time finding reliable stats on how many videos are uploaded daily, but it has over 1 billion users, and it's very much reliant on a deeply questionable algorithm to do any kind of content moderation at all. So current estimates are that 24,000 gigabytes of data gets uploaded to the internet per second. The internet is a beast that sweet, innocent Cox and Wyden could not possibly have foreseen. There is no functional way for actual human beings to moderate a torrent of data that massive. And moderation by machine is not exactly great at standing in for human judgment. Some companies handle it by demonetizing, algorithmically burying, or outright banning content containing certain words, which is how you get weird shit like TikTok users talking about unaliving themselves. Other companies make at least some attempt to have moderation teams that respond to reports or proactively go after potentially dangerous content, but those teams are often overworked, given poor instructions, extremely traumatized by the content that they have seen in the course of their jobs. And they're often very underpaid workers in poor countries. And then, of
Yeah.
course, you have companies like Twitter, which just go ahead and axe their moderation teams entirely.
I just want to, like, New York Times has some great press coverage from a few months ago. I can't remember the name of the article, but it was interviews with people who used to do content moderation for Facebook. And like a lot of them have straight up PTSD from the stuff they've seen. Cause like there's a lot of, yeah, like child sexual abuse material and straight up war footage on there.
Yeah, it is
It's
dire.
grim.
It is very dire. So the internet is a massive fire hose of content. A lot of that content is and should be illegal, and yet nobody is legally responsible for the fact that it's going up on social media sites. Do you see? This is a problem. The original purpose of Section 230 was to protect companies that chose to moderate their forums in order to encourage more moderation. But the result of Section 230 is exactly the opposite. By removing the threat of legal liability for user generated content, social media companies were able to grow past the scale where moderation is even a remotely feasible way to curb bad behavior. So, one could always hope that companies would be reined in by the free market. We are Americans, of course. We turn to the free market and ask it to save us. If a site fills up with users behaving badly, surely all the advertisers and good users who are viable sources of revenue would just leave, right? Wouldn't that solve all our problems, right?
I mean, yeah, that's exactly what's happened to Twitter, right?
So, one could argue that in the era of the algorithmic feed, social media companies have an incentive to encourage users to behave just a little bit badly, to kind of walk that line of what's permissible. Like I said, there have been a lot of whistleblowers from places like YouTube and Facebook. These are sites that are invested in a walled garden approach to content. They want to keep you on their site. They want the content to be sticky, meaning it keeps you around for longer. So it doesn't matter if you're having a good time. It doesn't matter if you're happy. What they want is you going down hours and hours of content rabbit holes. And that often means radicalization and polarization. So they're going to keep serving up content that may upset you, that may get you really keyed up, that may get you angry. Because if you are angry and upset, you are either one, going to continue watching those videos of things the government doesn't want you to know and go further down the rabbit hole, or you're going to respond by producing your own content, arguing with the content you just saw, which is going to continue feeding that gigantic algorithmic beast. Or you're going to get in an argument in the comments section, which is going to count as engagement for the thing that made you angry. And the algorithm is going to start showing that to more and more people because, oh, they're engaged. That must mean that people love it, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty horrifying. And I mean, just to make sure, just in case anyone it would accuse us of being kind of dismissive of the whole idea of a free market solution to this, I do think it is worth noting that in many cases, but particularly in social media, the advantage you have by being sort of an early arriver or an early adopter is pretty hard to overcome. Like the joke for what 5, 6, 7 years has been like that Facebook is essentially a boomer social media. But even though I don't use it certainly the way I did when I would when back in the good old days when it was only .edu accounts. I do still have a Facebook. I know that like most of our friends still have Facebooks. Most of my students who are teenagers who like would make fun of anyone who used Facebook regularly still have it because having an account is just fundamentally kind of like useful to have a presence, right? So that you can put up like a good social media page for your parents to see so they can be like, oh yeah, you're not up to too much trouble and you put all your wild shit on Instagram. It's the baked in advantage of the scope of the user base that some of these places have mean that when they go to shit, like Twitter, for example, there is this kind of like sunk cost associated with leaving them that makes the sort of free market approach not very viable, because a competitor like Mastodon, just to give one example, is going to have a hard time just matching the amount of active users that a place like Twitter or Facebook or what have you has. So, the assumption that some new social media site will come along and save us, I don't know if I buy it. And frankly, anything that does start to pull in that number of users is probably going to be something like TikTok that's using some shenanigans.
Oh boy. Yeah, TikTok certainly uses some shenanigans. I don't want to put all the hate on TikTok. Every other social media site deserves its fair share of side eye for some of the ways it collects user data, uses user data, keeps users on the site. I've worked in SEO for quite a while now. I know some shit.
As a high school teacher, I would like maybe not to throw like a majority of the shit at TikTok, but like a solid plurality. Like, I have a little bit of a special contempt for TikTok.
We're talking here about social media sites, but also consider things like Google, which arguably YouTube is user generated content, and of course the Google algorithm surfaces sites that are entirely user generated content. So to what extent is Google responsible for surfacing some of that content? We're going to get into that. We're going to
Oh,
get
let's
into
get
that.
into it. Let's get into it.
All right. So this kind of bad behavior is not just limited to people screaming at each other about holistic health cures online or whatever the fuck they do on TikTok these days. This bad behavior can have real world and fatal consequences. So in 2021, Frances Haugen, who'd worked for Facebook's civil integrity team, became a whistleblower and testified before the US Senate about her concerns about Facebook's lack of content moderation in combination with algorithms that were extremely good at spreading polarizing material. Among a few notable incidents, the platform has been accused of amplifying hate speech against Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, contributing to a genocide in which over 9,000 people were brutally murdered. It's also been accused of, among many other things, amplifying calls for genocide against Indian Muslims, giving excessive prominence to false grooming accusations against gay and transgender people. And of course, like all social media sites, it has been called out by the ADL for having a bit of a Nazi problem. And that is just what I found from 5 minutes of Googling, because talking about hate speech is all well and good. But I have to move on to another one of the internet's nastiest problems: child sexual abuse material.
Are we not covering the part where Facebook also destroyed America's electoral system?
Yeah, that's also a huge fucking problem. But that actually might be something that I make an entire separate case, because I have so much to say about that.
There's a lot to work with there.
Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah, I have quite a bit to say about that. But different legal codes around the world might wobble around a bit about what exactly constitutes protected speech versus hate speech. But there is one thing that is pretty close to universally agreed on in just about every legal code that exists, which is photographs and videos of children being sexually abused are bad and should be illegal. They should not be produced, they should not be sold, they should not be shared online. The consequences of producing or distributing this material should be criminal, and it should be severe. And yet, even though Section 230 was not intended to protect companies from criminal liability, that is functionally what it has done in cases like this. So when the Communications Decency Act became law, hosting and transmitting images online was technically challenging. It could take 30 seconds or more to load a single low-resolution image. Few people had digital cameras or scanners, and you had to either pay for a hosting package or own your own server to upload any images at all. But as image hosting became cheaper and more user-friendly, its use in crimes became much, much more common. So I have some very depressing statistics for you.
Can't wait.
So, between 1996 and 2005, the FBI's investigation into new cases of online child pornography, language of the time, / child sexual exploitation investigations ballooned by 2,026%.
Wow, you're right. That is depressing.
That's really fucking depressing. And there was a 1,312% increase in convictions and pretrial diversions. So by the end of 2005, the FBI's cyber division was devoting 38% of their time solely to investigations of child sexual exploitation online. That's it. That was a huge chunk of the entirety of the FBI's cyber division was just chasing down these illegal images.
Stop the ride, I want to get off.
So, and that was back in 2005, where image hosting was still a relatively new phenomenon. So fast forward to today. Pretty much everyone, including young children, walks around with a device that can take images and video, upload that content, and browse massive amounts of online content created by other users, which means we have very limited controls on what children see online. Remember, the original purpose of Section 230 was to encourage both moderation and encourage internet blocking software for the purposes of child safety on the user's end. And it means we have very, very outdated laws about the production of illegal content, which means that a lot of the people who get in trouble for distributing child exploitation content are themselves children who have taken photographs of themselves, because that is how the law has really not caught up with the ability of children to do that themselves.
We should take all children and shove them in bubble wrap and not let them out until they're 25 is really where I'm going with this.
So Section 230, even though it was not intended to protect any kind of social site from criminal liability for hosting images like this, that is functionally what it has done. The FBI is going after individual users and distribution rings. It has not gone after the social media sites that host this content. That kind of punishment has been almost entirely left up to the free market. And I think we're going to get a bit into kind of our final debate over some of the unintended blowbacks of letting the free market handle that, because they are quite bad.
Yeah, I mean, in general, free market solutions have not historically been great for anything other than making more money for the people who are invested in the free market. So I can't say I'm hugely surprised to find out that investing in, I guess, fundamental human decency doesn't have a great ROI and cash value.
So I could go on a lot more about illegal pornography, including the rise in new laws against revenge porn and how that impacts the way Section 230 is understood legally. But I want to make sure that we have time for another subject, which is terrorism, because the current state of the legal discussion about Section 230 has a lot to do with terrorism. The Supreme Court has heard, but both cases are still pending as far as I'm aware, two cases arising from the same set of facts in which justices have tried to tread very carefully around their own confusion about Section 230. One of them is Gonzalez v. Google. The other is Twitter v. I believe it's pronounced Tamne. Let me tell you the sad facts of this case. The father of a U.S. citizen killed by a terrorist attack in Paris has filed a lawsuit against Google, Twitter, and Facebook, claiming that these platforms recruit members, plan terrorist attacks, issue terrorist threats, instill fear, and intimidate civilian populations, and thus have aided and abetted terrorism.
It's pretty well documented, at least, that the Islamic State recruited heavily off of Facebook, right?
Oh, yes. I believe these cases are specifically about ISIS recruitment videos. But yes, the documentation is most definitely there. There is terrorist recruitment material available on all of these sites. But these are some complicated and fascinating cases, because the issue isn't just that the platforms hosted the content. The issue is that algorithmic feeds and related content suggestions mean that there is an argument to be made that these platforms are aiding and abetting terrorism, because the platform is just not sitting there passively hosting the content. It is actively serving up content to users. So that's a fascinating legal issue
Right.
that we don't really have great case law around.
to return to the sort of bookstore metaphor, it's the difference between, oh, I just have a book here that happens to be, what's one of the, what, like the anarchist's cookbook or something like that, right? Versus like taking that and putting it in a display at the front of the bookstore with a bunch of like neon signs pointing like, buy this, learn how to blow up a federal building. Don't. That's gonna. Hello to our new FBI listeners.
Well, just keep in mind, Libsyn is not legally responsible for anything we upload onto their platform, so go hog wild.
I think that's great for the folks at Libsyn, which is a fantastic audio hosting service. I would like to legally remind everyone that that was a metaphor, but it's the difference between like just having something and promoting it actively, right?
Yes. So this is a really, really fascinating issue that the Supreme Court is really struggling with right now. So the content is user-generated. Companies are theoretically protected from at least civil liability by Section 230. But what's an algorithm? Is an algorithm a moderator? Is an algorithm just passively on the site? Is an algorithm actively involved in serving up content, and thus a company might be legally responsible for what an algorithm does to users? Ooh, fascinating. Fascinating. That's a very interesting legal question. And it is a situation that has resulted in people being killed. So it is a legal question that we need to fucking solve.
Well, I'm sure it will be handled with all of the incredible urgency the United States approaches all of its, its major political issues with. So we'll get to it sometime before 2050.
So there are quite a lot of quotes from very confused justices about this case, about these two cases, which they are most definitely struggling with. I wanted to quote Justice Kagan. She puts it, quote, "We're a court. We don't really know about these things. These are not like the 9 greatest experts on the internet."
Yeah, I'm shocked to hear that. I mean, based on my own experience with older folks in the internet, I feel like the expertise is really there.
Yeah, so the Department of Justice has reviewed Section 230 and it has suggested 4 areas for reform. So I want to go over those. So number 1 is incentivizing online platforms to address illicit content, which right now, Section 230's kind of accidentally de-incentivized online platforms to address illicit content. So this is trying to bring it back in line with its original goal. So there are several parts of this. There is a bad Samaritan call out, which is if you're a truly bad actor, you don't get immunity. So, for instance, Stormfront would lose some of its immunity. Possibly something like a 8chan, probably lose some immunity there. I would love to see some of the cases that would arise from that.
Yeah, I think Parler immediately, which I would not be. What's the? It's a good example of the meme of the guy taking the like peace sign in front of the grave. That's where I'm at with that one.
So another part of incentivizing companies is call outs for child abuse, terrorism, and cyber stalking. So some of the speech that is so illegal on the internet should not be treated like your garden variety fraud spam. So, maybe somebody's weird get rich quick comment spam, that's not that much of a moderation priority. But there are some things that are happening on social media sites that are so bad that there has to be more of an incentive to moderate that kind of content, because there just isn't enough of an incentive to moderate it now. There's also case-specific carve-outs for actual knowledge or court judgments. So if a platform knows that a specific piece of posted content is breaking the law, they can't leave that content up. So it's not just an incentive to moderate, it's a requirement to moderate. So that's quite a big change and quite an interesting change. So part 2 of the Justice Department's suggestions are clarifying federal government enforcement capabilities to address unlawful content. So basically, better clarity about the fact that the federal government can bring civil enforcement actions by themselves. They don't have to sit there and wait for somebody to sue these companies. They can jump in there and bring some actions. Number three, promoting competition. Like you talked about earlier, with the fact that the internet is being concentrated in the hands of a smaller and smaller number of mega corporations. This would help some of the issues with breaking up those mega corporations by making it so that online platforms can't use their Section 230 immunity as an argument in federal antitrust claims. Antitrust is a very, very interesting field of law, and I certainly would love to see what something like this would do to some of the current arguments around antitrust.
Please.
And number four, promoting open discourse and greater transparency. So again, trying to get Section 230 back to its original purpose. So this would be clarifying language so that Section 230 serves its actual intended purpose of removing content harmful to children. Clarifying some more language to make it clear what good faith moderation entails, because right now, good faith moderation has essentially meant whatever kind of half-ass moderation you feel like doing. And it would permanently get rid of the moderator's dilemma, which is the whole reason that Cox and Wyden got together to write their amendment, by explicitly overruling Stratton Oakmont.
So all we need is for the federal government of the United States, and particularly Congress, to agree on what seems like common sense reforms to the way we handle internet law and pass them in a bipartisan manner.
Easy peasy, don't see any problems.
Yeah, should be easy enough. Look forward to that easy win.
So I want to open the floor for some friendly debate here, because the reason that I decided to cover Section 230 is that you came home saying that you've been listening to a podcast about Section 230 and you thought the whole thing needed to go. And I go, oh my God, no, we cannot get rid of Section 230. It's what the entire internet is based on. But I feel like maybe we're both starting to soften on our positions a little bit. I am starting to get pretty leery over the way Section 230 has been applied. And hopefully I have convinced you, or I will convince you in this debate section, of some of the importance of keeping at least parts of it around. Because there are some very important things that Section 230 does on the internet and should continue doing on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, my issue with the system as it currently exists is essentially how exploitable it is, and particularly how it enables the exploitation of people who, we all generally agree do not know any better. I am talking about, of course, kids. Like, I see the impact social media has on my students. I find it fascinating that when I talk to them one on one, most of them seem pretty willing to admit off the bat that it makes them miserable. And yet they're all on it. Like, literally, they are all on it. I have never met a student, and I guess at this point, I've probably worked with well over 2,000 who does not have an Instagram or like something like that. It's like the problem. I think the problem is very pervasive, and I think people just don't understand like the extent to which the ease of access of the internet enables some of the worst impulses we have, and therefore it really needs to be regulated in a way, like very differently from something like publishing, which is much more deliberate. You have to really like think about what it is you are doing when you publish a piece of material, and so you can't build a precedent off of that history in the same way, because it's fundamentally not the same thing, even though it's all communication.
Okay, so I want to push back on that a little bit. I want to ask the question of, why should the internet be child safe? And who determines what child safety is on the internet? Because again, Section 230 was not designed in an age where anyone understood something like algorithmically fed
Oh,
content.
I mean, to be clear, I think children should not be on the internet, like, period. Like, honestly, and I'm sure, I know a couple of my former kids listen to this. I think a few current day ones might have found it. So I'm sure they'll hate me for saying this. I don't think I don't think you should be able to have a smartphone before you're like 16 at minimum.
So this is an
I just don't
interesting
think
thing
there's the
to
political will for that.
So this is an interesting thing to bring up, because there are other laws like COPPA, which did attempt to put some guardrails on what kids are supposed to be doing on the internet. But everyone knows at this point it's very, very easy to get over those guardrails. So my question is, who gets to determine what is child safe on the internet? Because I'm going to go ahead and say uh, it is true in the United States that distributing pornography to minors is a crime. But I've also been a minor who, sorry, Dad, I know you listen to this. I was a minor who went searching for pornography. Nobody had to distribute that to me. I found that on my own. And I would not want the sites that distributed that pornography to me punished for it because I genuinely think in America we're a little bit fucked up about not letting teenagers see boobs.
I mean, I think there's a fundamental difference between that and something like social media. Like, I don't think of Pornhub as a social media site. That is its own can of worms. I
Oh,
know.
oh, oh.
I see your finger. Put your damn finger down. Let me
That's
finish.
user generated content, buddy.
Yeah, and I think it needs to be regulated differently than other forms of user generated content, which is not the same thing as banning it, right? My concern is that I have seen I literally have I have seen kids get radical, like I have watched kids be radicalized by YouTube as I am teaching them. And there's without some attempts to address that, I mean, to be entirely honest, I don't see a functional future for the American system, period. Because as it exists right now, we just can't, our society just does not seem capable of dealing with this issue. Um, I don't think that it is possible or desirable necessarily to totally lock kids out of the participating in the internet. Like, it needs to be kind of training wheeled. But I think we do need to be clear that there is a pretty clear danger, not just in terms of oh, the kids are going to see the filth and their minds will be ruined, but literally to the fundamental functioning of a democratic system as it exists right now. That's that is the stuff I am concerned about. It is not really, frankly, sexually explicit material. I kind of expect that teenagers will go looking for that. And as long as what they are finding is not literally criminal in the sense of what we have talked about, I just desperately don't want to know. But I choose ignorance, to be clear.
This is the problem, is that we would then have to reform quite a few other laws in the US about distribution of content if we got rid of or majorly reformed Section 230.
Well, I mean, all political change in this country is fundamentally a pipe dream right now. So we might as well dream big.
But I do agree with you. One of the biggest problems on the internet today is that there's functionally no legal clarity around the way recommendation and search algorithms actually work. Section 230 was just written in an age where I don't think Google existed. Was any search engine extant in 1996?
In 1996, I mean, maybe Ask Jeeves, but no, I think that was more. I think that was later. I think that was an invention of the 2000s.
Yeah, it was not designed for the internet as it currently exists. And I agree. Okay, I definitely agree with you. There has to be regulation of the way that algorithms serve content, because under the logic of Section 230, that's no longer just moderation. That is actively engaging with the users in a way that should be regulated. The question is how we regulate it, because like I said, I've worked in SEO for a while. Those algorithms are largely black boxes. The companies are not required to disclose how they work. There are some genuine reasons why they are not required to disclose it. Because little gremlins like myself get really good at gaming them when we know how it works. So the question is, how do we regulate an algorithm that we can't fully see?
I mean, I don't see the problem with people knowing how to game that system. as long as we are gaming it on a level playing field, that is what the American system is. We theoretically game the stock market on an even playing field. We theoretically game the education system on an even playing field. That's consonant with the way we manage other aspects of our society.
Oh, buddy, I can come up with a lot of reasons why the way algorithms are currently being gamed is a problem. For instance,
Yeah,
if
I know
you've noticed,
currently is a problem, but if it's totally opaque, what is or not? If it's totally transparent, what's happening? That's different.
well, if you notice that Google search results have really gone to shit lately, it's because of excessive gaming of the Google search algorithm. If you have noticed that something I particularly find fascinating, if you've noticed that things like all of the videos that you are served on places like Facebook are people making weird foods in toilets and things like that, it is because of a group of uh, Las Vegas stage magicians have learned how to game the algorithm to fill it up with junk that makes people angry. I really recommend looking up a journalist named Ryan Broderick if you want to learn more about that. He has done some amazing reporting about that. But the internet is filling up with weird junk, and some of that junk has some very bad consequences. It's not all people eating spaghetti out of toilets. It's terrorism.
I mean, I think just fundamentally for me, the thing like the two things I don't see my position on changing anytime soon are first of all that the idea of a totally unmoderated free marketplace of ideas is stupid. People I think wave that around just like, oh, everyone should be able to speak and the truth will sort itself out. There's no historical evidence that supports that's how it works. It is much easier to lie early and vocally than it is to then fact check those lies and shut them back down. And that starting from that premise, you cannot trust companies to handle that regulation because they are not interested in trying to preserve a functional like discursive space, any kind of functional public forum of ideas. They are interested in making money off of you when you engage in your product. And so the only other remaining option is for the government to do it, as far as I
Mhm.
see it.
I would agree with that, but I would question which government, because remember, we are in a federal system in which different states get to set different legal codes. I am very nervous about, for instance, suddenly flipping a switch on who's criminally liable for what kind of speech, and all of a sudden, the state of Florida gets to start prosecuting people who post information for transgender teens online, or the state of Tennessee decides to start prosecuting people who say it's okay to be gay. Or a country like Russia decides that it gets to start taking people to court for what they post online. Or a country like China decides to start taking people to court. I mean, China already takes people to
Decides
court.
to, yeah, you're missing a verb tense
But
there.
uh, a country like China can take a company like Facebook to court.
I mean, I think that's a good reason why American companies shouldn't be operating in those places. I know they will try to anyway because they want to make money, but I don't really fucking care. I guess is how I would put it. Um, that's all true, but all laws can be weaponized in bad faith.
Hmm.
Like that's the fact that a law can be used for bad faith reasons is not really an argument against any one specific law in my view because all of them can be weaponized for bad faith reasons.
Hmm.
Like
Well,
we have found ways to weaponize the commerce clause in this country.
do you trust the current Supreme Court of the United States to make the right judgment call when cases about moderation come up?
Absolutely not, but I also don't think this is the only thing that will fix American democracy. And in conclusion, that's why you have to fucking vote.
Yes. In conclusion, vote, because the internet is an absolute fucking shit show. And okay, before we end, I want to talk about a bit about the current and future state of moderation, because if I agree with you, and for the most part, I do agree with you, there does need to be some criminal liability for some of the shit that is happening on the internet. But the question is, if there is criminal liability, if all of these companies can be taken to court for user-generated content, or at least for how the algorithms surface user-generated content, the question becomes, who is responsible for moderating that content? Practically, how is it actually going to be done? Because right now, the majority of content moderation on the internet is done by very exploited workers in the global south who are having not a very good time. So if humans go back to moderating more of the internet, I would say that we need some protections for those humans. Children are not the only people who can be harmed by seeing bad things on the internet. That's a much larger workers' rights problem.
I would absolutely agree. And, tech companies, again, famous for their respect for the dignity of their workers. So I'm sure there's no need for the government to make sure and to regulate how those people are being treated.
And of course, the question of AI. So AI is really exploding. It starts to raise some very, very interesting questions about machine learning and other instances where no actual human choice has put the thumb on the scales of what an algorithm might surface, what a bit of very clever predictive text like ChatGPT might hallucinate while attempting to give you an answer. If ChatGPT gives you some really fucked up advice, who is responsible?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're kind of getting to here is that the ways in which we communicate on the internet, the kind of the trope was when I was a kid. I don't know if you heard this, that like the internet was just this revolutionary technology that was going to fundamentally change human society, always positioned in this very kind of utopian way of it's going to enable this free discourse that will kind of spread good, knowledge all over the world. It certainly has changed human society, and it is changing it at a rate much faster than I think most of us can stay on top of. Um, but not really always or even primarily in a positive way. And so, like, if we're gonna do this, and it seems like we've committed to this as a society and a species, we're gonna have to be kind of aggressive about considering these questions of what it is we are doing with this technology, and not just kind of letting it regulate itself, because the capacities that it represents, like, I don't know, you take APU or European history, right?
Mm-hmm.
It starts in 1500, not solely, but largely because of the printing press, a revolutionary new technology for distributing information. And the internet's a little more efficient than the printing press was. So,
Mm-hmm.
if the printing press is kind of the dawn of modern civilization, and kind of fundamentally has reshaped humanity, what's the internet? And because of that, we're gonna have to think pretty carefully, like, about what it is we're doing with it. I guess is the
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Okay, I do want to take one last stand for championing at least the parts of the spirit, if not the application of Section 230, which is that Section 230 has allowed the internet to flourish in some really amazing ways. It has allowed marginalized groups to get together to advocate for themselves in ways that simply would not be possible if there was much more restriction on user generated content. I do want to say, as there has been a rise in things like abortion bans in states, there are a lot of really important questions about if one state outlaws any distribution of material about abortion, but someone in another state is posting information on how to safely have an abortion, that information needs to stay up. So how do we make sure, as we're regulating content, how do we make sure that the information that should stay up needs to stay up? And I would say in some ways, Section 230 did not go far enough in protecting companies from other exterior pressures about what kind of content is on their site. We talked a good game about porn, but you might have noticed that the internet is a lot less porny than it used to be. And part of that is because, in the absence of clear government information about user generated content that is crossing the line, and what the penalties for that are. A lot of payment processors have taken it upon themselves, and especially the Apple App Store has taken it upon itself to blanket punish any kind of sexual expression online. So, any pornography, even perfectly legally produced and distributed pornography, can get you booted out of the App Store, which is pretty much a company killer. It can get payment processors to stop working with you, which is absolutely a company killer. And that has major blowback, not just on sex workers who have absolutely every right to make a living. And working online is one of the safest way that sex workers can make a living. But it has blowback on people like nursing mothers, people with mastectomy scars who are showing those scars off in public, artists. There are a lot of people whose content has been swept up in purges that were done because out of fear of payment processing being taken away, or out of companies being removed from the App Store. Any government clarity about what companies are liable for also needs to contain clarity about what companies are not liable for and what companies should not be punished by payment processors and by app stores for. Because I am deeply, deeply concerned about the way that private corporations have started essentially content moderating other private corporations. That's a huge online problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with all of that. I don't think any company is morally capable of making those choices, which is why it should be the man. Because there's not really another option. And at least if you vote, the government is more accountable to the actual people that are affected by this than a company is.
In an extremely rare decision for us, I think we are coming out in favor of government regulation of pornography today.
I mean, better them than fucking MasterCard.
I do also want to put a plug in. If you want to know more about that subject, there is an amazing podcast called Hot Money Who Rules Porn. I really recommend checking that one out. That is a deep dive into functionally corporations attempting to regulate other corporations. I found that really fascinating.
And in the meantime, if folks want to, I don't. There's no joke I can think of that wouldn't be a little terrifying to say out loud. I guess if folks want to share their views on the complexities of regulating user-generated content, where can they find us?
You can find us on the social media platform where artistic nudity is allowed, tumblr.com. We are facing backward on Tumblr.
We also have a website, facingbackward.com.
And you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/facingbackward.
And a special thanks to our patrons who have donated at the shout-out level to support the podcast. They are Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Cat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird. A house is a perfectly cromulent mascot, and the fish I catch are Rhodes Scholars compared to Samuel Alito. Schmuck. Thankfully, Samuel Alito gets to help decide some of this, so that's great.
All right, Samuel Alito, the fate of internet pornography is in your weird, sweaty hands.
Oh, God, we never should have broken away from Great Britain.
Oh, Great Britain's even worse. Oh, we're going to talk about some British laws possibly for Pride Month. Oh, it's worse.
At least they behead their rulers occasionally to keep them on their toes.